welcome. Today, we've got a book with a title that definitely makes you look twice. Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left by Jonah Goldberg. I mean, our goal in this is to really get into Goldberg's main argument, which is, well, pretty audacious. He's basically saying that American liberalism isn't the polar opposite of fascism. Instead, he argues, it actually shares surprising historical roots, ideological connections, and even that, in some ways, it is a kind of totalitarian political religion. That's his term. It's a major claim.
And a big part of Goldberg's focus is how the word fascism itself gets used. He argues it's often thrown around as a political weapon, like a cudgel, mostly by the left against people they disagree with. And his point is doing that so much has blinded many people to what he sees as their own fascistic proclivities.
It's not just semantics. It's about a whole mindset he's identifying.
Exactly. It's about a pattern of thought, a pattern of action he thinks has a real history.
That definitely sets us up. I can already see this might lead to making you rethink what left and right even mean today. So where does Goldberg start building this case? What's the first piece?
All right, so let's start where Goldberg does, which is wrestling with the word fascism itself. He claims many modern liberals, leftists, tend to see fascism everywhere, except, as he puts it, when they look in the mirror. It's like, once you slap that label on someone, it becomes maybe too easy to just dismiss them entirely.
That's the danger he points to, yeah. And his core assertion is incredibly direct. He literally writes, "It is my argument that American liberalism is a totalitarian political religion." And to show how the fascist label gets tossed around, he gives examples, like Al Gore comparing global warming skeptics to Holocaust deniers, or Bill Clinton calling the Texas GOP platform a fascist tract.
Right. I remember some of that rhetoric. And he mentions authors, too, like Chris Hedges writing American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. Goldberg sees this as a consistent rhetorical strategy, not just, isolated slip-ups. So this obviously leads to the big question. How does Goldberg define fascism? He admits it's tricky, it looked different in different places, but he insists international fascism drew from the same intellectual wellsprings as American progressivism. That's a key link for him.
Okay.
His working definition. He calls fascism fundamentally a religion of the state. It's this idea of an organic national unity where the state's job is to shape the nation according to the will of the people as the state defines it. Crucially, he argues it's inherently totalitarian because it views everything as political. Anything the state does is justified if it serves those ultimate, often utopian goals.
That's quite a definition. Broader than you usually hear.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really wild. Goldberg argues American progressivism wasn't just influenced by similar ideas, but was maybe even a major source for the fascist ideas later used in Europe by Mussolini and Hitler. How does he support that? That seems like a huge leap.
His starting point is Woodrow Wilson's presidency, especially during World War I. Goldberg actually calls Wilson's wartime administration a fascistic dictatorship in America. He points to things like massive wartime censorship, widespread government propaganda run by George Creel's Committee on Public Information, which was basically the first big modern government propaganda ministry in the West. Wilson also used groups like the American Protective League to enforce loyalty. Even things like militaristic social programs, like the Civilian Conservation Corps. Goldberg sees that as foreshadowing later things like JFK's Peace Corps, but with a more state control vibe. And digging into Wilson's philosophy, Goldberg describes him as having an infatuation with political power. Wilson apparently felt that checks and balances, the separation of powers, had proven mischievous. They
got in the way of progress.
Right. Goldberg sees Wilson's worldview as this mix of Darwinian organicism society as a living thing that needs expert guidance to evolve correctly. And also this Christian messianism where Wilson saw himself almost as a divine instrument and the state. That was the holy sword of God's crusade.
A very powerful, almost spiritual role for the state itself.
Exactly. It wasn't just policy for Wilson, according to Goldberg. It was a deep-seated ideology about the power and destiny of the state.
And it's chilling how Goldberg then draws a line from that history to today. That common phrase, it can't happen here, the idea that America's immune to authoritarianism, completely ignores this real American history of what he calls fascistic tendencies, rooted right there in the progressive push to Europeanize America with a powerful modern state aimed at utopian goals. So if the progressive era laid the seeds, according to Goldberg, how did these ideas play out later in the 20th century, especially when you look at big figures like Mussolini in Italy and FDR here in the U.S.? What's the connection he makes?
Well, it's surprising. He starts with Mussolini's background, not some right-wing figure initially. Mussolini began as a leading radical socialist.
Really? A social?
Yeah. And his early fascism, it was seen by many people, even Mussolini himself, as a project of the left. He drew from similar intellectual sources as Lenin and Trotsky, and Mussolini actually got a lot of praise from prominent Western liberal intellectuals and journalists in the 20s and early 30s.
Like who?
Magazines like The New Republic, influential writers like Walter Lippmann, they were apparently quite taken with Mussolini's pragmatic approach, his experimentation. They saw his regime as this, efficient, modern way to get Italy moving, which leads to Goldberg's next point. The fascist flavor, as he calls it, of FDR's New Deal wasn't some hidden secret. It was openly discussed and often viewed pretty positively at the time.
How so?
Well, Goldberg argues there was this broad, almost bipartisan consensus during the Great Depression that the crisis was so bad it required policies that looked dictatorial and fascistic. FDR himself talked about bold, persistent experimentation. That was his mantra. And Goldberg gives a concrete example. General Hugh Johnson, the guy who ran the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, a huge New Deal agency, Goldberg calls Johnson an ardent disciple of fascism. He even gave out Mussolini-inspired pamphlets like The Corporate State to his team.
Wow. The NRA Blue Eagle.
The Blue Eagle symbol, Johnson called it a symbol of solidarity, and his rhetoric was very aggressive. Those who are not with us are against us, very collectivist. Goldberg even notes that Hitler admired FDR's methods, and Mussolini reportedly said, America has a dictator in Roosevelt.
That's a perspective you definitely don't get in standard history lessons. It really flips the script on who admired whom. And Goldberg makes a big deal about this idea of the third way. He argues it's fundamentally a fascistic concept, this promise that all good things go together and all hard choices are false choices. It sounds appealing, right? Like you can have it all. But Goldberg suggests it's dangerous because it papers over real conflicts and the need for actual compromise. Okay, let's jump ahead now. The 1960s. Goldberg calls this a third fascist moment in America. And it's specifically linked to the youth movements of that era. That time is often romanticized, but Goldberg sees something different.
He argues that fascism, almost by definition, is a youth movement. It tends to elevate passion over reason, action over deliberation,
Motion over logic.
He draws these parallels between German youth culture back in the 1920s and early 30s, that emphasis on rebellion, nature, mysticism, idealism, and the American New Left in the 60s. He sees a shared revolt against reason. For instance, he talks about how intellectuals in SDS, students for a democratic society, embraced what he calls existential pragmatism. Meaning prioritizing immediate action, lived experience over fixed principles or ideologies, which led figures like Tom Hayden to see violence not just as a tactic, but as potentially redemptive, even necessary for real change. Saul Alinsky's famous Rules for Radicals, very influential on the left, shares a kind of fascist contempt for bourgeois morality. Basically, the ends justify the means. And this leads him into probably the most explosive part of the book, what he calls liberal racism and the eugenic ghost. He argues that many key American progressives, names like Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Herbert Grolley, were deeply invested in eugenics. They saw it as a modern science for fixing social problems, for improving the population, often along racial lines.
Which is completely at odds with how modern liberalism sees itself.
Completely. And Goldberg provides examples. Like, he notes the KKK's role in pushing for progressive reforms, like prohibition, which had its own racial and class dimensions. But then he tries to connect it to today. He argues that some modern liberal policies, like certain ways of doing affirmative action or multiculturalism, that they unknowingly echo that older identity-based collectivist thinking found in eugenics. He suggests they can fall into a kind of racial essentialism, defining people primarily by their group identity, which then justifies different treatment, discrimination even, in the name of achieving diversity. He sees a disturbing echo there.
That is a deeply challenging argument, linking eugenics to modern policies like that.
The book also gets into economics and culture, what Goldberg calls a culture camp, a culture war. How do those fit into his overall thesis about liberal fascism?
Well, on economics, he first pushes back against what he calls the persistent myth that fascism was just a puppet of big business. He says that's a Marxist gospel. He argues both Nazi Germany and New Deal America showed this blurring of lines between government and major industries, a kind of state capitalism or corporatism. Businesses weren't just free agents. They became, in his words, transmission belts for state goals, state propaganda, state values.
He points to things like the Nazi regime's public health campaigns, like their war on cancer, or the promotion of organic foods, things that sound surprisingly modern. He parallels that with the New Deal NRA demanding corporate citizenship from businesses, forcing them to adopt codes and display the Blue Eagle. Goldberg calls this impulse eternal corporatism, and he sees it continuing today when large corporations benefit from complex regulations and publicly adopt progressive stances, like GE's Eco-Imagination environmental initiative. Then there's the cultural side, the Kulturkampf. He traces this idea back to Otto von Bismarck in 19th century Germany. Bismarck launched a culture struggle to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church and tie citizens more closely to the German state, the Volksstate.
Replacing religious loyalty with national loyalty.
Essentially, replacing traditional authority with state authority. Goldberg then connects this directly to the Nazis, who explicitly tried to sideline Christianity. They pushed to abolish mandatory prayer in schools, ban Christmas carols, and promote a kind of neo-pagan state religion. The goal was a new state-sponsored dogma. And building on that, Goldberg argues that modern liberalism shows signs of its own religion of government.
How does he see that playing out?
He points to things like Hillary Clinton's talk about a politics of meaning, or proposals like Michael Lerner's idea for ethical impact reports for government actions and even private businesses. Goldberg interprets these as attempts to give the state, the political collective, a kind of spiritual significance. He argues the goal is to create a new national community that provides people with meaning, purpose, authenticity, things traditionally found elsewhere, like in religion or local communities. The danger, in his view, is that this often defines national unity as everyone agreeing with the progressive project, essentially defining opposition itself as illegitimate.
So, pulling all this together, what's the big takeaway for us today? How does Goldberg's liberal fascism challenge our standard political map? It definitely scrambles the usual left-right categories.
It absolutely does, and Goldberg ends with a pretty stark warning. The real danger for America, if it stops believing in its founding principles, isn't that it will believe in nothing, but that it can believe in anything. He argues that any movement built on the idea that the government can love you and the state can give you meaning must eventually mark a course for hell. That's a very strong statement about the potential endpoint of vesting too much hope and power in the political sphere. Goldberg believes that good dogma, meaning sound principles, tested traditions, is the best defense against bad ideas. He sees the liberal fascist project as trying to tear down all dogma, all established truths. So it really invites you, the listener, to think critically about the assumptions behind political movements. What does progress really mean? And could good intentions, if unchecked by sound principles, lead us somewhere unexpected, maybe even somewhere harmful? It's a call to question the underlying beliefs driving political action, always.